I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World, our 14th in our mini-series of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, covering all the stories in the Avon 1970 edition of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. This is a big one, Mars's Heven by Ray Bradbury. It's one that Judge Marc Rothenberg, joining us here today, has especially requested at the beginning of this process. So you had to wait 14 episodes to get on here, Marc. But you guys know Marc if you're a regular to this podcast. Marc and I do our best reads of the year podcast every January, where we count down all of our favorite reads. So you'll have that next month. We'll get to Marc in a second, but our first time guest is Phil Nichols, who is representing the Ray Bradbury Center. So we have two Indianapolis connections to this podcast, three if you count the fact that I grew up in Indiana too. So this is a very Indiana heavy episode in that regards. But Phil is one of the leading scholars of Bradbury's work, and he's the editor of the New Bradbury Review and senior advisor to the Ray Bradbury Center at IUPUI in Indianapolis, which I know I've been. Marc, you've been to the center, right?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah. And Phil, you supervise PhD students, if I'm correct, and in your you oversee a lot of the studies of Ray Bradbury by editing the review, but you also hosted Bradbury 100, and you've been a regular guest talking about Ray Bradbury on one of my favorite podcasts, Seth Heasley's Who Goes There. Seth has been on this series twice already. So, but Phil, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And our other guest ready to talk Ray Bradbury is Judge Marc Rothenberg. As I said, he is a regular on this podcast. And when I say judge, he really is a judge. So
it is true. That's my day job.
Yes. But for fun, you do a shit ton of reading, and you're my oldest horror literature buddy. Like, we go back way back in time.
Well over 30 years.
Yes, we do. Now, I have two announcements of two books that I want to promote right now, and then we'll move on. I always have to bring up also that every Tuesday night at 6:00 PST, Pacific time, we do a live interview for the Dickheads podcast. It's called the PKD Hangout. In the first hour, we have a guest. Like, for example, this week we have Wei, who is a professor of Chinese, who teaches Chinese science fiction. And we're going to do he's going to give us the whole lowdown on what is happening in the Chinese science fiction scene. And so that's going to be really cool. And then, like, next week we have Bill Cyril on, who is one of Phil's best friends, and he's currently writing he's also a physicist, and he's writing a book on he has all these theories about Phil and on orthogonal time. It's really wild stuff. So, like, I highly recommend that one. So that happens every Tuesday. Who knows when you listen to this who the guest is going to be that Tuesday, but you can always find that. And personally, I'm going to be on a panel talking about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep in San Francisco at the SF and SF on November 23rd. So if you're in the Bay Area, come see David Gill and I talking about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And I think Pamela Jackson, who was the editor of the published version of Phil's Exegesis, I think is going to be the third panelist. So that's coming up in San Francisco, November 23rd, SF and SF. And real quickly, this is my most recent novel, Great America and Dead World. It's a experiment. I used the Philip K. Dick formula to write my own novel about the modern world. And the idea was to method act as Phil coming from 1963 and how would he write about MAGA, climate change, and all that kind of stuff. And this is out from Quire Publishing, Great American Dead World. And then I also have a story in Space Horrors, which is an anthology that's pretty, you can see by the title, it's Space Horrors. That's what the stories are. And I have a story in here called Sentence to the Crucible. So I just wanted to bring that up. So sorry that you guys had to sit and listen to all my announcements, but I got to do that because I don't make money off this podcast. I don't monetize this. All I can do is ask you folks to support me by buying my crap. It's not crap. I think it's really good stuff. So let's start with our Ray Bradbury origin stories. Phil, since you're the expert, let's go with you first. Like, how did you discover Ray Bradbury and how did he become so important to you?
I was given a book in a classroom as a child. I was probably 12 years old, 12 or 13. Everyone in the class was given The Golden Apples of the Sun, which was Bradbury's sort of breakthrough short story collection in terms of breaking out of the genres of horror and science fiction and sort of becoming a respectable writer. And so respectable in the UK, where I live, that you could give the book to school kids to read. And because the stories are all so very diverse, it's a great book to study because it's not like a novel that you have to plow through hundreds of pages. It's lots of these little bite-sized stories. So I was really taken by that. And it was probably the first book I was ever given as a student that I enjoyed reading. But I didn't know anything about the author. A couple of years later, I discovered another of his books, which was The October Country, which is horror stories, basically. And that made me think, wow, there's much more to this writer than I ever thought. And this is me still about 12 or 14 or something. And the years go by and I start discovering more and more of his books. And then there came a point somewhere where I saw the various films that were made of his work. So there was a pretty terrible film of The Illustrated Man, not very good miniseries of The Martian Chronicles. And I was both drawn to these things because his name was on them, but also appalled by them because they were terrible and they weren't nearly as good as the stories. So I just became fascinated by how that happens. How do you get from a good story in a book to a terrible movie? How on earth does that happen? So I just became interested in that and stuck with him and started researching into his work. And it sort of grew from there. And I ended up doing a PhD on his screenwriting. And I still don't really know why those good stories turn into crap films. I wish I knew.
Well, that can happen sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Mark, where did you discover Ray Bradbury in your journey?
So when I was I don't know, like 10 years old, maybe 1982, maybe even a little bit younger, 8, 9 years old, my library and my school had some really cool books. And one thing they got was a collected volume of EC Comics, Weird Science, which we'll probably talk about here a little bit because that's one of the adaptions. I actually don't own that, but I do own the collected EC Comics Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror. But that's where I got my first exposure to Bradbury. As a matter of fact, it was this particular story. And I think I'm sure they've done other Bradbury. They've done a lot of adaptions. EC Comics as
We'll
I
talk
think.
about that.
Yeah, we'll talk because that's a whole thing, right? With
Yeah.
Bradbury and how he got involved in that, officially involved in that. But that was my first exposure, and I really liked it. And unlike Phil, though, I fondly remember the Illustrated Man. It wasn't great, right? But I remember what became my favorite, one of my favorite stories of Bradbury's, which is the Veld, right? I remember it from that. But yeah, they weren't great adaptions. Over time, I read more and more. To me, there's two in my opinion, the two greatest authors are Bradbury and Ellison, and they kind of go back and forth as far as sci-fi, depending on what day I'm feeling. But Bradbury will always have, growing up in the Midwest, even though it was Indianapolis, I had friends and family who grew up in, Waukegan and places in Illinois right around where Bradbury was. So that small town Midwestern value that he wrote about always intrigued me as I grew up and I read more and more and more. But that's why I love Ray Bradbury. And then, of course, as I grew up, I started watching Ray Bradbury theater where he'd always introduce when he'd go to his workshop. And, that was the introduction to that, which, yeah. So Mars is Heaven, again, always has a special place in my heart because it really was one of the first stories that I was exposed to. And that's kind of the reason I asked you to do this, David.
Right. Well, and here's my admission. I'm not a huge Ray Bradbury fan. Got to be honest with all y'all. I'm covering all these stories, so I'm not anti-Ray Bradbury by any stretch. I like Ray Bradbury. I think Something Wicked This Way Comes is one of my favorites. And that was my introduction to Bradbury was the movie, Something Wicked This Way Comes, which I actually think is very good. Not as good as the book. But as a young person, I liked the movie enough that I tracked down the book and read it. One of the funny things is that I had a copy of Martian Chronicles throughout my childhood that sat on my shelf completely unread. But it was on my shelf throughout my childhood. And eventually I read Something Wicked This Way Comes, and then read Martian Chronicles after that, which of course, part of Mars's Heaven Mars's Heaven was adapted into part of that. And but like everyone knows, I'm a PKD guy. I'm a John Brunner, Lee Brackett, I know Ray Bradbury performed her wedding. There's a lot of authors that I can point to that I appreciate. That being said, all I have to do is reach like right in front of me, right here on my desk, and I've got Zen and the Art of Writing. So I respect Bradbury, and enough so that I am a fan to a degree, but I'm not as into Bradbury as I am PKD and some of those other writers, which we can get into later. But that's just my admission. And I've said that of a couple of these authors that we've had here on the Hall of Fame. The opposite of a fan of John W. Campbell, and I covered him just as respectfully as I could, right? And his story in here was actually great anyways, so it is what it is. The thing is that I respect Ray Bradbury's role almost more than I actually appreciate the work. Does that make sense? And I loved visiting the Ray Bradbury Center when I was in Indianapolis last. Well, not the last time I was in Indianapolis, but it was a couple times ago. But in fact, Mark, we met for lunch or something soon after that, or we got together. Yeah. But you didn't go with me. We met each other later in the day. But I will say, if for anyone who is in the Midwest at any point, the Ray Bradbury Center is definitely worth a trip, and we'll get more into that later. We're just doing introductions now. So, as I always do, I'm going to do a little bit of the history of the author and the story. Now Phil will know better than me, so if I get anything wrong, correct me here. Like I said, he's not my my expertise, but Bradbury lived till he was, I believe, 14 years old in Illinois. He was 14 years old when he moved to Los Angeles. So a lot of the inspiration for things like October Country and Something Wicked This Way comes from this Midwestern upbringing that he had till he was 14. So it's really funny because I think of Ray Bradbury as an LA writer. The majority of his life he lived in LA, but everyone has this pastoral Midwestern feeling when they think of Ray Bradbury. And it's just interesting because that was really just his childhood. But I mean, Phil, would you argue that that's like, an important part of his DNA really as a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it does inform, even when he was a Los Angeles writer, it still informs that. I mean, in real life, he lobbied for the monorail to be built in LA.
Yeah.
And it was a callback to his love of the old trolley bus that ran in Waukegan in his childhood. I mean, it was also a futuristic thing. But it very much.
He also never had his driver's license, so he was a public transportation guy too. So
that's true.
Which I respect.
Yeah. And he was often photographed with his bicycle, but how much he actually rode that around LA, I'm not really sure. I have a feeling he only ever brought it out when the publicity cameras were around.
Right.
I could be wrong. But no, he was very influenced by that childhood. And I think probably because it was sort of cut off, there's a distinct cut off for him as his family moved and never went back to the Midwest. So it was always there as a sort of a vision of the past. Whereas those of us maybe who grew up in one place maybe don't have such a clear division between the past and the present. It's sort of like it was all one continuous thing. But I think Bradbury, it's very clear that he has this division right down the middle of his life. And I think his best work is probably in that nostalgic mode.
Yeah. Well, and Mark, you and I are Midwestern people, so like, we grew up not one state over, but that Midwestern feeling is a huge part of the thing that I'm sure is part of the sauce that attracted you to Bradbury.
Oh yeah, I would say definitely. As a matter of fact, when I drive, I drive various places with my job, and when I drive through small towns in Indiana, heading down towards French Lick or stuff, I'll drive through cities that have that old town square with, those bandstands that still kind of exist, and they do still exist. So the kind of town that's described, although it's described a little bit differently in this story, but in a lot of his stories, exist in the Midwest. I mean, they really do. That small town, even Something Wicked This Way comes. Those places still very much exist. And it's really almost like stepping back through history. But yeah, it is kind of that homegrown science fiction horror, because I would still consider Bradbury, my genre is mostly horror, but Bradbury's stuff is horrific at times. This story included, very much so. So yeah, that's kind of what attracts me to Bradbury. There's definitely a connection there. And you talk about the Bradbury Center here in Indianapolis. I mean, I remember going to see, was it either 2000 or 2001, he came here. I think it might have been one of his last appearances with Douglas Adams and gave a lecture in Butler. And I remember seeing that. And he talked about how fond he was of Indiana. And even though he lived out west and stuff, he always considered the Midwest his home. And that was sort of his writing domain. I remember that part of the lecture. I think at that point he had a stroke already. But, and he might have been wheelchair bound a little bit, but he was still sharp as a tack.
Yeah. I saw him a couple of years after that at an event in San Diego, and unfortunately he was not in as good a shape, I think, when we saw him down here. But and I do think that sometimes and he was very much in the nostalgia of the Midwest in the talk that he gave here too. So I mean, I do think it was an incredibly important part of his psyche and who he was as a writer. Much like how Phil's absence of his twin sister kind of haunted and oversaw like all of his fiction. I think that absence, or that being pulled out of what he felt like was home, I think kind of overshadowed a lot of Bradbury's work. You know, like I said, I'm not an expert in Bradbury, but it seems to me that's like kind of one of the themes that that permeates a lot of his fiction. Now, like a lot of golden age authors who discovered science fiction early in the 30s, it was the science fiction clubs that existed at the time that kind of took Ray Bradbury from just being a reader to being like an active part of it. And much like when we did the episode on Nightfall and we talked about Asimov and how Asimov came up through the Futurians in New York, it was Asimov's ability to a lot of these writers that came up in this era, like Robert Bloch, Isaac Asimov, all of them had mentors, like older writers that they looked up to, that they met through these clubs. And it was Bob Olson was the one that was kind of credited as being like the LA writer that Ray looked up to and would visit. And but he also became friends with Forrest Ackerman through the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, which, by the way, still exists and is still active. It's one of the longest running and active groups. And trust me, I know, because I've been communicating with them about our PKD Fest coming up in Fullerton, August 20th through the 23rd in Fullerton, California, coming up, folks. So I know this group still exists and they're still very active. They're putting on Worldcon next year. And it's one of the most longest running active groups, but their original meetings were at the Pacific Electric building in downtown LA, which is now an apartment building, but you can see it. And they also had meetings at the Clifton cafeteria, and that Clifton cafeteria building is still there. These are all places, by the way, that I'm kind of adding to my list. So when eventually I do similar to the PKD pilgrimage that we made to the Bay Area sites where Phil slept and lived and wrote, I'm gonna try to do this for LA at some point, and these places are on the list. One of the places on the list is 8777 Lookout Mountain Avenue, and that is the Laurel Canyon home in 1940 of Robert Heinlein. And there was a science fiction writers group called the Manana Literary Society that got together, and they would critique work and talk to each other about work. And this was highly fictionalized in Tony Boucher's book Rocket to the Morgue. If you have not read this, it should be on your reading list. I know I've promoted this book many times. It's a locked door murder mystery that happens at a fictionalized version of the Manana Literary Society. So there's fictional L. Ron Hubbards and Henry Kuttners and all in here. And if you're astute enough, you can read and figure out who they are. And if you're a nerd like me, you have a highlighted version where you're trying to decode all of it. So that's Rocket to the Morgue by Tony Boucher. Now, one of the people that went to these meetings a lot was Ray Bradbury. He's not in Rocket to the Morgue because he was a quiet, shy member of the group who didn't really have enough characteristics to get made fun of by Tony Boucher in his book, like Heinlein and Hubbard and those folks. But one of the most important connections that happened at those meetings was a connection between Ray Bradbury and Lee Brackett. Lee Brackett should be in this book. It's a fucking crime that she's not in this book, because there are only two women that made this book, C.L. Moore and Judith Merrill. That is also a crime. There should be more representation by women. And one of the best science fiction writers of the 20th century, without a doubt, was Lee Brackett. Her novel, The Big Jump, is the one that I will always point to as being incredible. But Lee Brackett also played a huge and very important role in the career of one Ray Bradbury, because when he was first writing stories, the person that he gave stories to and got feedback from was Lee Brackett. If you take a tour of the Ray Bradbury Center, as I have done and as Mark has done, and Phil probably has given those tours, the role of Lee Brackett in his life and vice versa is very important. When Lee Brackett was sick and when she was dying and she was trying to finish the final screenplay of The Empire Strikes Back, who was the first person she sent it to? Was Ray Bradbury. Who was her backup if she was too sick to finish it? Ray Bradbury. And that's why the Bradbury Center has a very early draft of The Empire Strikes Back there that you can look at. I spoiled that I was a part of a group tour because when Dr. Ackerman was giving the tour and was like setting up the story, and like I'm the one that was like, Lee Brackett, like before he intended to. So I'm the one that ruined that. But Lee Brackett was also, or Ray Bradbury also officiated the wedding of Lee Brackett and fellow science fiction writer Edmund Hamilton when they got married. Yeah, Ray Bradbury did it. And so Ray Bradbury credited Lee Brackett with giving him the feedback that provided him with the ability to sell his first story. So at least as far as I can tell, I don't know. Is anything I'm saying incorrect here, Phil?
No, it's pretty much right. I mean, there were other people that he relied on as well, and Henry Kuttner was one of them. But
yes.
I think he was probably closer with Lee Brackett. I mean, they would go to the beach at Venice, and she would read his stories, and he would read her stories, and he would always more or less say, "Well, yours is perfect," and she would say, "Yeah, but yours needs this fixing, and why don't you do this?" You know.
Right.
And they did a little bit of collaborating as well. There are two stories that bear the fingerprints of both of them. One is officially credited to the pair of them as a co-write, and the other one is a Bradbury story, but Lee Brackett wrote the beginning of it. So you know, they helped each other out in those early days.
Yeah, they were close, and yes, and Henry Kuttner, of course, is an important one. We've already covered him and his wife, C.L. Moore, on this series. So you can go back and look for that episode on Mimsies. But and of course, another connection to Indianapolis, because C.L. Moore, of course, grew up in Indianapolis, and here again, another pilgrimage you should make is to the old Fletcher Trust building, which is a Hilton hotel where C.L. Moore worked. Is not far from the IUPUI Ray Bradbury Center. Geographically, it's like 2 miles away. And the mail slot where she sent out her stories and typed up H.P. Lovecraft stories and sent them to Weird Tales, that mail slot is still in the lobby of the hotel. I have tried and so far failed to get a plaque put into that lobby, but I'm still working on the Hilton Corporation, who is mostly ignoring me. Even though I got a letter signed by Stephen King saying, among others, I got a letter signed by 50 luminaries in the fiction world, and I still can't get the plaque up there. I'm trying. But nonetheless, it's there, so you can see that mail slot. I know on this series, when we did that coverage of them, I showed a picture of the mail slot, so you can see it. But regardless, Henry Kuttner was very important as well. You're right. And It's funny because you can see that with these writers that are friends, for example, too, like Charles Beaumont, didn't publish as much as Richard Matheson or William F. Nolan, but you can see his fingerprint on everything that they write and his influence as a writer. And I, think that all of us who write fiction are products of our influences and our teachers and so on. So I think that's good stuff. Mark, have you read any Lee Brackett, or am I going to have to shame you into that?
You'll probably have to shame me a little bit into it. I'm trying to remember. I mean, I know that she was involved in that group. She was, if I remember, I mean, I know about her. She was married to another writer. I don't remember who
Edmund
that was.
Hamilton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I really know. I really haven't,
Well,
again,
she is most famous for, of course, having written the first draft of Empire Strikes
Empire
Back
Strikes Back, correct.
and The Big Sleep.
Oh yeah, she wrote a lot of stuff, a lot of crime stuff, a lot of pulp scripts
Yes.
for movies and stuff too. I remember that as well.
Yeah.
I think she did something with Howard Hawks. I don't remember what that was either. Maybe some westerns. Maybe she wrote some westerns.
Yes.
She wrote.
I'm not a western. I'm a big. David will tell you I'm a big film guy, so I kind of know these random bits about ridiculously stupid stuff. But I don't know. Never with certainty, only on certain things. But I'm a big fan of Hawks, so I know that she did do some stuff with him, and I think they were some of the westerns.
Yeah, I'm looking over
that
at my Lee Brackett shelf, and the two that I would first recommend to people for just really high quality science fiction is The Big Jump, which was published do-si-do with Phil's first novel, the Solar Lottery, in the 50s, but you can buy it standalone. And then The Long Tomorrow, which is a post-nuclear novel, is quite incredible. And then all of her Eric John Stark books are, very good pulpy Mars, like fantasy, like Edgar Rice Burroughs type stuff. So yeah, highly recommended. But back to Ray Bradbury. That's who we're here to talk about. So let me see. Okay, so Mars is Heaven is an early story for Bradbury. It was published in 1948, but I believe he was publishing for a few years at that point. I'm not sure how early was he publishing, Phil?
From about the age of 18. So, which would have been 10 years before this.
Yeah.
So he had a meteoric rise, really. I mean, he was publishing a fanzine before he was published in anything that he was paid for. And then he was publishing stories from about 1938 onwards, and they got progressively better. On one of my podcasts, I have a thread called Chronological Bradbury, where I've been reading the stories in the order that they were published. And although I've read all the stories before, only when doing this venture for the podcast did I read them in the correct order. Well, a correct order at least.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to see his development, because the earliest stories are very clunky and clearly based on what he'd read from other writers. You could see.
Is there one that you think is a turning point?
Well, the real turning point is the story called The Lake, which is a sort of a nostalgic tale, but it's also a horror tale. It's a guy goes back to the small town that he was brought up in, where his best friend, a little girl, disappeared into the lake and never came back. And as an adult, he goes back and somebody's found something in the lake. ...
See, I have a very similar journey with PKD, because this last year I did. So we're compiling the Philip K. Dick Encyclopedia, and we have a team of 20 researchers. But some maniac had the idea that he was going to do all the encyclopedia entries for every short story that Philip K. Dick wrote. Yeah. So I read all 123 in the last year, pretty much in chronological order. Not quite, but mostly. So I had the same experience, but I was writing I wrote a book's worth of material just in the entries for the short stories. So I saw a similar thing too. Like and it's funny because you could see the stories where he really like kind of came into his own. And he was lucky. It was his second story, I think. Well, his first actual sale was Rug, and that one I think was pretty good, but I think it was his second and first published story, Beyond Lies the Wub, where you really saw Phil be using all of his parts. So the lake, you feel like that one is the one where he really comes into his own, like just
Yeah, I mean, there were some before that are very good stories, but I think The Lake is the one that has this very specific blend. It's got the horror, and he had this early run of writing horror stories that were in Weird Tales. One year, I think maybe 1943, he was in every single issue of Weird Tales, and the stories are very good by that point. But The Lake is the one that's got this sort of personal touch because it's got the reflective bit of going back to your childhood. And so that feels like, this is a Bradbury story rather than this is a good story, you know.
Well, and there comes a point with Bradbury at some point where he gets kind of out of the science fiction ghetto. I believe that would have been after Mars's Heaven, sometime after this story, and he gets to become the respected writer, a respected, outside of the ghetto of science fiction. And that's something that, my boy Phil craved his whole life and never got. And I think it's funny because some science fiction writers, that's not really a concern, that's not really like a thing, and I don't know that Ray Bradbury was really craving it, it just kind of happened. And I don't know if that was Fahrenheit 451 or what it was that
and maybe Phil, you could chime in on this. I think part of it was Bradbury's personality. He was willing to be that ambassador to not only science fiction, but just science, right? Space travel, all of that. So he was coming in at the right time with all this innovation. And, while I love Philip Dick wasn't that ambassador.
No,
right?
No, you're not putting that guy on TV.
Yeah, you're not putting him on TV. Exactly. He's not sitting up there pointing to, to NASA's, whatever.
Rocket.
Going, this is where we are. Yeah, this is where we're going. No, it's not happening. Whereas Bradbury was that guy from the Midwest. He was the guy who was likable, who could talk, who you just felt comfortable. You were like, hey, I could sit and have a chat with this guy, and he's just a normal guy. He's not this bigwig author or anything like that. At least that's how I always felt when I
No,
I think imagine if they put Phil up there, he'd be like, do we know if that rocket's real? Do we know if it really exists?
We all know where this is. We all know where these aliens are from.
Yeah. No, you and I admit one of the reasons I like Phil is because because I think he was kind of a maniac. But and that's not the guy. I mean, Ray Bradbury was a super intelligent.
But again, that willingness to be the ambassador, and again, I think Phil. I mean, what's your thought on that? On his, because I always thought that was fascinating about Bradbury, because he worked with Disney, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit. He did like these big idea projects, right? That I think transcended most science fiction authors at the time.
Yes, and it all started really when he started breaking into film. He wrote Moby Dick for John Huston in the 1950s, and he was working with all sorts of filmmakers on projects that didn't get made mostly. But that sort of broke him out of being just the literary writer, and he started writing essays, and these were published in quite respectable magazines, and that again broke him out of that, and he became this kind of certainly in his later life, he became this raconteur. He was on chat shows all the time. I don't think you ever saw PKD on a chat show.
Once again, at least not one that would probably be very popular. I mean, it'd be popular amongst a certain group, but he's not. You got to turn it on and go, oh, I mean, maybe Dick Cavett might have had him on at some point, but that was just.
Well, he just didn't have he didn't have the sales or the mainstream to even get the attention at the time.
Correct.
None of that.
Bradbury became, as I think you indicated just now, the sort of the respectable face of science fiction, because he wrote these books that were not difficult. They had science fiction content, but they weren't difficult for people to understand. And they were poetic. And he also wrote books which were poetic and not science fiction. And it was clear that he could write in all sorts of ways. And he was published well outside of the field. He would send his stories wherever he thought they would fit. He didn't say, well, I'm going to target this magazine and write a story in the style of this magazine. He would write whatever he wrote and then say, where shall I send this? So some of his stories, which ended up in Dandelion Wine, for instance, were published in women's magazines. There was one I was reading the other day, which was published in Good Housekeeping. And, again, this is not where you would find PKD or Asimov or even Lee Brackett writing.
Exactly. No. And that now I will say that PKD was starting to break into more mainstream, like Omni, and he had a story in Playboy, and the last like two of the last like 4 stories he wrote, but that happened at the end of his life, and we'll never know if he would have continued on that path. But still, Omni's not Good Housekeeping. It's not, and Bradbury had a certain stretch that again, you're not seeing JG Ballard in there either, right? Like you're just not going to. So
well, I mean, here's a perfect example of how Bradbury transcended, in my opinion. I mean, I was in 6th grade, I think in 1984, 1985. No, it was earlier than that. But 6th or 7th grade, and I'm reading in school. I'm reading, no, maybe 6th, 7th, or 8th grade, Fahrenheit 451, and we weren't reading science fiction aside from that book. I mean, that and Shirley Jackson's Lottery to me were pretty unusual scholarly reads to be required reading in school. But that showed me, hey, wait, there's something special about this guy. Why did they pick this author and I had been reading science fiction by that point, but why would they pick Bradbury instead of, say, Dune, or instead of James Herbert or something like that? And I think part of it was the way he, as you mentioned, he was accessible. It wasn't like you had to pick it up. Even H.P. Lovecraft at times isn't accessible, right? You'd have to pick it up and really kind of read some. But again, the stories that he wrote just came off like, a guy was just sitting in a chair telling you a story, and they were fantastic, right?
Yeah, and I do know that we're starting to see that Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is starting to get taught in this similar way. But I think that has to do with the cultural impact of Blade Runner more than it does anything else. But Fahrenheit 451, I did have to read for school, and and I think the problem is, I think that most teenagers are not getting it a lot, and that it all depends on who's teaching it. And I particularly didn't have a teacher who was very good at teaching Fahrenheit 451. But I have it on the shelf right now, and I've been planning to reread it maybe next year. I think I had already read Something Wicked This Way Comes when I had it assigned to me, and I remember thinking that I just thought that was better at the time, but it is what it is. All right, so we've talked a lot of generalities about Bradbury. We got to get into Mars is Heaven. Mars is Heaven appeared in Planet Stories, which is a magazine that Phil's first story appeared in, but his first appearance wasn't his first sale, but first appearance, Beyond Lies the Wub. And Phil described Planet Stories as the, quote, most lurid of pulp magazines. So Planet Stories was not exactly considered the most high class, but Planet Stories was one that had been under the same editorial direction for the pretty much from the beginning. I thought I had written down the name of the guy who edited it, but I don't. But I know that around this time in the late 40s to early 50s, Jerome Bixby did a, they had different editors that were kind of coming in and out of Planet Stories, but the same owner oversaw it. And I believe that it was let me see if I have. I believe it was Jerome Bixby who was the editor at the time who bought Mars is Heaven, but I'm not entirely certain of that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, and then so Mars is Heaven appeared in the issue, but it was not the headlining story. The headlining story was Citadel of the Green Death, and which was credited to the author Robert Emmett McDowell. Robert Emmett McDowell was not a person; it was a pen name for. Let's see. I've got my notes a little bit jumbled here. It was a pen name for Catherine McLean, who was a very prolific author of science fiction around that era. She has a fantastic story called Contagion in The Future is Female. If you've ever Lisa Yazik's collection, which I've covered on this podcast. There was also Against the Stone Beasts by James Blish, which I did not read, but I thumbed through a little bit. And that's very time travel, monster, space opera story. And then A. Bertram Chandler has a story in here, and he was a Australian science fiction author at the time. In fact, the Australian Science Fiction Award is the Bertram Chandler Award. So kind of an important person. But, I think now the most famous thing about this fall issue from 1948 of Planet Stories is that Mars is Heaven premiered in it, right? So all those other stories, I had never heard of any of those before I started researching this.
The only one I'd heard of is there's a William Tenn story in there called The Brooklyn Project, which I've seen in some other anthology.
Yeah.
It obviously, it never made the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, but it's been in some other sort of retrospective anthologies. So I knew of that one.
Yeah. And so this issue, like we always kind of go through the table of contents in these issues in these episodes. And but what's interesting is a lot of times I'll like share screen and we'll look at the magazine together, but there was not an Internet Archive scan of this one. So I think we're getting to the point where these are under copyrights or not as easy to find.
No, you just didn't look hard enough because I
Oh,
found
okay.
it.
You found it? Okay. I guess I didn't look hard enough. But some of these you can find very easily. But as far as the issue goes, it's a pretty good issue of Planet Stories, but I think the best and most important thing in here is definitely Mars is Heaven. That's the best story in there. And let's get into the story. Do either one of you want to take the summary job? Anyone going to jump forward for that?
Sure. I mean, I can give it to you from my point of view. I just to let you all know, I do have my copy here, and I have both the original Mars is Heaven, and I have the third expedition here, which I both read recently to prep for this. Mars is Heaven is about a group of it's about a mission to Mars. They land on Mars. I don't know how detailed you want me to get into this, but I'll give the basic summary. They find out that the atmosphere is completely breathable, so let's go check it out, because that's what you do in the 1950s when you land on Mars. And what they find is there's a town there, and not just any town, a very Midwestern town, and they're playing similar music, not only similar music, but actual music from, American, I guess you'd call it American heritage music, like I forgot the song. It was about the Ohio. Was it On the Banks of the
Beautiful
Ohio?
Ohio.
There you
Beautiful
go. Beautiful
Ohio.
Ohio, which of course comes to the conclusion that, wait, they must have an Ohio River here. So things sort of get off. They're a little suspicious. The captain's very suspicious. He takes two people with him to the small settlement that they see, which appears to be, again, a Midwestern town, a bandstand, people walking around. He tells everyone else stay in the rocket, which of course they don't eventually do, because why would you? And it turns out that they encounter some people, and I'll hand it over to Phil. They encounter some people who they know, or they used to know.
And we can spoil at this point because
I think we have to, right? I've kind of been dancing around it. Because you're going to have to spoil this story to talk about this story.
If you have not read the story, then what the hell's wrong with you for listening this far? But if you have not, this is a good time to pause it and come back.
Well, they all meet relatives, don't they?
Yep.
Mostly dead relatives. So that prompts one of them to say, "Is Mars heaven?" And the captain is the most skeptical of them all. This can't be real. This must be some illusion. And then his folks turn up. I think it's his parents or his grandparents. And so all of a sudden he's convinced of it. And his brother is there. I think his dead brother is there. And basically he discovers that they're Martians. They're out to kill them. And they do. And the story ends with them, with the expedition dead and buried in the ground. And the Martians have a marching band that plays, and all the Martians watch the funeral and then disperse. So
and that the end of the story is the part I really want to talk about, but we could talk about the minutia before you get to the end, because I think the end, and it's interesting, Phil, because you know the two versions of it, and you do as well, David. I don't know if you read the third expedition recently.
Not recently. I
But
read Martian Chronicles
he did
25
rework
years
it,
ago.
and there's a couple little nuances there that I think changed the story quite a bit. It should be known that the best reveal is how he finds out that they're Martians, right? He's sitting in bed with his dead brother, just sort of, relaxing, listening to the music as night is going on, and the captain starts thinking to himself, well, how could this be, really? The skepticism kind of crawls back into his head, right? How could this be? Well, let's assume that they were Martians, and these aren't really dead relatives, and I'm not really in heaven. How would they know? Oh, wait a minute. What if they have telepathy? And they're just reading our thoughts, and they're building this whole thing off of our thoughts. That would be weird. And they're really just going to kill us. That would be weird, too. Yeah. I'm going to get out of here, is what he thinks. And he's like, I'll just leave. And his brother stops him in the middle of the night, and he goes, where are you going? He goes, oh, I'm going to get a glass of water. And his brother goes, but you're not thirsty. And that's the end of that. And then the next morning, you see them burying all of the townspeople, the Martians, burying all of the people from the rocket. And then they destroy the rocket, right? That's like the last line. They destroy the rocket. Now, what I'm talking about with the rewrite, which Phil, maybe you can clue me in as to why he did it. Now, there's certain things in sort of the rewrite that he does to make it more adaptable to the Martian Chronicles, right? He changes the timeline of where they are. But in the rewrite, they don't destroy the ship. It's really strange. That part they don't do. And in the rewrite, the captain realizes he's the one that's they've read his mind, and he's the one that they've exclusively designed this town after. They've just populated with other people's family members. Any idea why he did it that way, or was it just to make a quasi-different story? I always wondered about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've not read him talking about that specifically, but my assumption, simply from the way the story sits in the Martian Chronicles, is that it is all about adapting it to fit that context. In the Martian Chronicles, this turns out to be the third expedition to Mars, and the two previous ones have been unsuccessful. This one is unsuccessful. The next one is going to be the successful one, but only by accident. So it's to do with that progression. It's also to do with what we've seen in the prior stories. So in the second expedition, the expedition arrive on Mars, and the Martians assume that they are not Earth people, but Martians, but mad Martians. So they're treated as lunatics and they're put in an asylum. And then I can't remember how they die, but they're killed by the Martians in that.
As Martians are wont to do, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Especially at that time, Martians are killing you. You're not getting away.
Well,
and in fact, the very first. Sorry, just to finish that thread. The very first expedition, the first contact between the Earth people and the Martians happens in the mind of a Martian woman called Ila. She has this dream, and the dream is of this Earth person coming in a big shiny ship. And her husband, her Martian husband, goes off and kills the crew when they land. But she's seen it in a dream, first of all. So we've seen this kind of telepathy take place in that earlier story. So he wants to make the Mars's Heven that's in the Martian Chronicles. He wants to make it match what's there earlier. So he's got these sort of ideas weaving.
Makes total sense.
Stories. Yeah. But the one tiny difference, I don't know why they don't blow up the ship. And the more I think about that seems odd, because that means the ship presumably is still there. And you'd think one of the following expeditions would find it. And maybe there is a reference in the next story, actually. Maybe there is a reference to finding the ship. I can't remember now. I'd have to go and look at that. But the other thing that he changes, a very small thing, but instead of blowing up the ship, he has the brass band playing a very specific song, which is Columbia Gem of the Ocean.
Correct, he does. I noticed that too, but I wrote that off as just being, just something else he did.
Yeah, which it is, but I think when you take it in the totality of the Martian Chronicles is really a retelling of the origin of the United States. It's not so much Earth going to Mars, it's America going to Mars. And there's all sorts of things in there that are American references. So he's just put one more in there, and he's put it in as this ironic thing of what are the Martians going to play at your funeral when you land on Mars? Well, they're going to play the songs that are in your head. So clearly they've taken the song out of the captain's head as well, along with everything else that they've taken.
The one other thing. Yeah, go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
Did he adapt many of his short stories into novel-length works? Because Phil did that all the freaking time. I mean, there's like 13 of them, of the novels that were expanded short story ideas.
Right. Yes, he did. I mean, the Martian Chronicles is really a collection of short stories, but he stitches them together to make it look like a novel. Dandelion Wine is the same. Something Wicked This Way Comes originated in a short story, which he then turned into a film script, and then turned the film script into the novel, and then he turned the novel back into a film script, and the film was made.
Right.
He's always going from short pieces.
And that was a Ferris wheel, right? That turned back time instead of the merry-go-round, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and so here's the thing about Mars's Heaven. Being that it was 1948, I thought like the whole kind of simulated reality that they're going into, that the Martians put them through this thing and kind of trick them into this reality, I think is pretty good. It's pretty original concept, especially if you look at 1948. Fritz Lieber had already done an alternate reality, simulated reality novella. I think it's Destiny Draws 3. I think it's what it was called. I could be wrong about the title, but I know it was Fritz Lieber. And I know it was a huge influence on PKD, on the later stuff he would do with alternate realities and stuff like that. But and I would say Von Vogt was probably the most popular science fiction author at the time. However, this was a pretty original concept. So I think that's one of the reasons why it fits into the Hall of Fame position and why it got so many votes for it. Because remember, all these stories were voted in by the writers, right?
They were, but I reread the introduction the other day by Silverberg, and he explains how it was done. And I think he says that something like 15 stories were actually voted in, and then he filled up the rest of the book by taking authors who had received a lot of votes rather than individual stories. So this story is in that extra section. It's not one that was actually voted in on its own right. It's that Bradbury.
So it would mean that Silverberg chose this one.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we had to put our Silverberg hat on, and I know he's still with us, and
Yes.
we could technically ask him, but why, in your opinion, Phil, as a you know, we're dickheads, so what's a Bradbury? A Bradburian, as a Bradburian.
I think you've just coined it, a Bradburian.
Bradburian, yeah. What do you think is special about Martyrs Heaven? I know I have my opinion, and I'm sure Mark has his opinion, and we could go after you, but what do you think makes this story stand out as a Ray Bradbury, you know, selection for the Hall of Fame?
It's got pretty much everything that he does. It's a horror story, but it's also a science fiction story. The horror is of the psychological variety, which is what he really excels in. His early stories like The Crowd, which is about a car crash where the same crowd of people turn up to every single car crash that happens in the city. So he writes these sort of psychological stories in his early career, and this story is one of those. It's also got the nostalgia in there. Now, in 1948, that probably didn't mean very much to people reading it, but certainly by the mid to late 50s, when Bradbury had written all of his Dandelion Wine stories, he was definitely known as this nostalgic writer. And this story has got the nostalgia in there because it's all about these people and their dead relatives from, I think, the 1920s is referenced in the original version of the stories. But then he moves the year onward in the Martian Chronicles, I think. But yeah, it's that. So it's got everything that Bradbury is known to be good at from today's perspective, if you like, is present in this story. And it's a science fiction story that works for people who don't like science fiction because it's really a horror story. It just happens to be set on Mars.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Strangely, there's another story that when I read this story, there's another story that comes to mind which takes place on Earth, and it is Boys Raise Giant Mushrooms in Your Cellar.
Oh yeah.
So that comes much later in his career. I want to say that's maybe in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yes.
But he writes again the same type of story. There's that nostalgic aspect to it. There's the paranoia aspect to it. There's the psychological horror aspect to it. There's the skepticism, the outsider who eventually sort of buys into it, and you know he eats the mushrooms, and that's the end of that because his son has been growing them in his basement. So I see the thread, and I always have with Bradbury. Again, you can tell a Ray Bradbury story when you read it, and this, I can read the story and go, "This is a Ray Bradbury story." Trying to think of a story that maybe he wrote that I would be like, "This is not a Ray Brad." Do any stories come to mind? I know we're talking about this, but do any stories break that sort of template? The Crowd kind of breaks that template a little bit.
A little bit. I mean, his early stories, often you might be fooled into thinking that it's some other writer because he hadn't fully developed that style. But I think once you get to stories written in the 50s and later, he almost becomes self-conscious. And you sometimes think with his later work, you think he's turned on the Bradbury switch now. He's deliberately putting in Bradburyisms, But in the earlier stuff, I think his writing was more transparent in the early days with the stuff that was in Weird Tales. Not that he was trying to write like Lovecraft or anything like that, but he was trying to write in a clear, lucid style and perhaps didn't feel that he could put his own imprint on the stories at that stage.
I mean, it's going to sound silly, but when I think of Ray Bradbury, I think of he's sort of the everyman science fiction writer, right? He is like I said, you could sit and he could tell you a story. He could be your grandfather who's telling you a story, or your uncle who tells you a fantastic story.
Yeah.
Um, and it's very accessible.
Mm.
All of his stories are extremely accessible. I I'm trying to think of one that might not be, to be honest with you, and I have a hard time coming up with one that I could just go, yeah, this one's just too quirky. It's too weird. It's too out there. Um, like I said,
There aren't many.
even the Velt to me, which is probably my favorite Bradbury story, isn't too weird, especially nowadays with everyone on their computers and with kids on their computers all the time, right?
Yeah.
It's not. It's relatable. His stories are relatable, and I think that kind of stands the test of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't have anything like Three Stigmata, like
Yeah.
PKD, where that's like so weird that like people bounce off it all the time and are just like, this is just, I have no idea what the hell he's writing about. And it's funny because it's one that, you know, now that I've read it 3 times, it seems real obvious to me, but I have to remind myself, like, not everybody gets into it that way. Well, look, and I will say this, like, and I'll use Stephen King as an example, like, so I, you know, I've mentioned PKD enough in this episode, but so Stephen King, like, we know enough about his history that those of us who read his early works, like I know that he was living in the trailer, writing in the water heater room when he wrote Salem's Lot, right? And Carrie. And one thing that's interesting with Bradbury is the 40s. I'm very curious to know how he was writing. Was he handwriting these stories? Because we know that the whole renting the typewriter in the Powell library happened for Fahrenheit, and that was after this. So did he have a typewriter at this point? Was he between typewriters? Was he handwriting? I don't know. So it's
No,
always
he was typing.
okay.
He was typing. He writing Fahrenheit 451 in the basement of the library wasn't because he didn't have a typewriter. It's because he wanted, well, two things. One, he wanted to be away from home so that he wasn't getting in the way of his wife. But also he wanted to have books all around him because he was writing a book about books. So he wanted
Okay.
to be in a library for
I
the
just assumed he
inspiration.
didn't have a typewriter at the time.
But
Well,
no,
look,
he was typing.
you could tell. I mean, I'm a guy who can um I can date PKD's work based on what the typesetting looks like on the
Yeah.
on the outlines. So I am very curious on what he was typing on, and that fills in a hole for me on that.
Well,
But you never
Bradbury.
know. Lovecraft was handwriting most of his work. In
Mm,
fact, you know, C.L. Moore was the one who typed up Call of Cthulhu for him and sent it
ah,
to Weird
yeah,
Tales.
yeah.
And like she did this for Robert E. Howard. She did this for several writers because she had access to a really nice typewriter at the insurance company she worked at. And she made extra money by having writers say, sure, send me send me a couple bucks. Oh, probably then it was send me some cents and I will type up your story. And she looked at it as an opportunity to get to read these early works and like learn from these writers, right? So
Mm,
she typed them up and did that like in the
mm,
30s. This was in the 30s.
mm.
But and I think at that time maybe not all the writers had access to a typewriter. But
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
now, yeah, you're definitely filling in a gap for me there, Phil. I wondered about that. So okay, so he had a typewriter. He just was trying to get out of the house.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of
Can I
writers do
can I
that.
can I
Yeah,
say something about Stephen King?
sure.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you know this book, Dance
Oh, of
Macabre.
course. I read
Yeah.
Dance Macabre. Yeah.
If you turn to chapter 2, Stephen King says, my first experience with real horror came at the hands of Ray Bradbury. It was an adaptation of his story Mars is Heaven on Dimension X, and this would have been broadcast around 1951, which would have made me 4 at the time. So Stephen King claims to be a horror writer because he heard Mars is Heaven on the radio at the age of 4.
Which you can listen to. It is on YouTube.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Yes.
I
It is on
listened to the
YouTube.
Dimension X and I listened to the X minus 0
1.
or
X minus 1.
X minus 1. Yeah, I listened to both those versions.
Yeah.
And I actually think they're a better adaptation than the Ray Bradbury theater one.
Come on, Hal Linden makes a
well-
pretty convincing captain.
He does.
Yeah, I quite like that TV one.
Yeah,
It's
but
fine.
it's got a sweetness to it, right? It does.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this goes back to your question of what makes this story special. And I would say the thing that is external to the story that makes it special is this huge influence that it's had on people. It was in Planet Stories. Okay, that probably had a fairly small circulation because it was just a pulp magazine. In 1950, it was in Esquire, which was kind of like a poor man's Playboy of the time. Then it was in the Martian Chronicles, so it's one of the key chapters of the book. The story was on Dimension X in 1950. They also did an adaptation of the whole of the Martian Chronicles, all crammed into 30 minutes on Dimension X in that same year. So this one story and the book that it's a part of was sort of a little explosion of media in 1950. And then it turns up on TV eventually, because it's in the Martian Chronicles TV miniseries. It's on the Ray Bradbury Theatre. It's been adapted countless times. There have been these comic adaptations that Mark was referring to earlier on. So, and Stephen King has claimed influence from it. Some other authors have also claimed influence from it. So it's a very influential story. And I've seen any number of rip-offs of Mars is Heaven, basically stories where people have been under hypnotic control by aliens in a very similar way. Even part of Solaris, the Stanislav Lem novel, I think reflects some of what goes on in Mars is Heaven. So I think it's been a very influential work, either overtly or subconsciously.
Oh yeah, 100%. And you know, I wouldn't be surprised if it. Well, yeah, I mean, it had an influence on everybody. I mean, I think that's its outsized. That's why I think it works for the Hall of Fame. And a lot of these episodes will say, you know, is there a story from this author that you think would be better represented in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame? And I'm not sure that there is one that I think would be a better representation. Maybe the Velt, maybe as a science fiction story, or Sound of Thunder, maybe. But
Yeah.
you know,
I think there's a lot. I just don't think there's anything as I mean, look, this has the elements you want in your classic science fiction. Travel to another planet, right? Aliens, human, a bit of human hubris, I suppose you could say, or you know, just being, hey, we're humans. You know, of course this is for us. Of course this is heaven. You know, yeah. You know, well, no one's gonna outsmart us. Oh, wait a minute, what if they did? But I think it's interesting, Phil, what you said about this influencing other things. And I mean, you look at some of and I'd have to pull up who the writers are, but you look up some of the episodes of The Twilight Zone, and some of those are very similar to this, right? Like People Are Like All Over with Roddy McDowall in it. And I'd probably have to look up who wrote that one. But I think there are a lot of people who go, hey, there's something to this. Are there any stories before this by other authors that have sort of the same concept, the same influence, or something that might have influenced Bradbury in writing this? I have no idea.
Yeah, I've not been able to find anything. I'm sure there must have been somewhere in the pulps, because you know that everything has a precursor somewhere in those pulp magazines, but I've never stumbled across anything. So it does seem to be fairly original, but if somebody turns something up one day, I'd be delighted to know about it. But as far as I know, it is an original thing that's been copied since, you know.
Yeah, there's not one that really jumps to my mind either, but and I think as far as Bradbury's influence on all of it, like it's clear that he deserves a spot in this anthology, and it's clear that this story represents, with its Midwestern things, and it's it is a very Bradbury story. So it fits in that regard. Not, I think the only other two that I think could be argued are, the Velt and Sound of Thunder. Maybe you could argue that they're better pure science fiction stories, but I think Phil, you're right. The influence is a huge part of what makes it a science fiction Hall of Fame story. So, in his role here too this is early in his career, and it's cool to see a story that's from before, like he kind of, while he was still a golden age pulp writer like the rest of them, and I think that plays for a cool part of history, because then you get the next author you get is C.M. Kornbluth, right? And C.M. Kornbluth is an author who you got to be a deep cutter to remember C.M. Kornbluth at this point. And it's not to say that his work isn't equally important. It's just he's not the name that Ray Bradbury was, right?
Yeah.
And look, you mentioned the Twilight Zone, yes, and especially like the tension with the Twilight Zone. We only got one Twilight Zone from Ray Bradbury. We got the Icing and Body Electric, and that was it. And the tension between Serling and Bradbury, and the kind of surliness that they kind of had between each other. And it's interesting because Bradbury was friends with all the California sorcerers, the Matheson, the Nolans, the Beaumonts, but he, it's funny. And I, knew Bill Nolan briefly when, we lived up there, and I did ask him one time about what he knew about that whole Bradbury thing. And he said that he basically was like, well, Bradbury didn't like to run around like the rest of us. And one of the reasons why he wasn't as close to those guys is they used to run around. They used to race cars and do other things for fun. They were smoking a lot of weed and doing stuff, and I think Matheson kind of dropped off a little bit with that too, because he had kids earlier than the other ones, and so if you look at that, where if you look at all the stories about the California sorcerers, you'll see that and I did a bunch of this for my research for the tour, because there's a lot of the places that they hung out that are still there, like Barney's Beanery and like the coffee shop that they used to hang out at. And you see a lot of those stories, and Bradbury was not there with them, but he was friends with all of them. And when they got down to work and to talking about ideas and bouncing things off each other, Bradbury was a part of that group.
And I don't want to get too far off on the tangent here, but as I just mentioned, and it's funny, I just looked it up, talking about the Twilight Zones and things that would have been influenced by this potentially. And the one story again in the Twilight Zone that comes to mind is people are like all over where if you remember, the two men go to, I want to say Mars or Venus, I don't remember where, and they encounter a human being there. And it turns out that really not a human being, just, again, someone with mental telepathy, and they trick them into thinking they're a human being, and then they put them in a zoo at the very end. And that was written by Paul Warren Fairman, who I admittedly don't know much about at all. As an author, evidently he was, just looking it up, he was the editor for Amazing Stories, but this would have come after this story. And there are a lot of similarities there. It's interesting that, the Twilight Zone and Bradbury is an interesting thing, because again, and I do want to talk about that EC Comics thing, because Bradbury writes a lot of adaptations, right? He writes for, there's stuff, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. There's a lot of stuff out there at the time, but again, he only does do Icing the Body Electric for Twilight Zone, which I find very interesting, right? And part of it, as you pointed out, could have just been, hey, he was this Midwestern guy. He didn't want to get involved in all of that stuff, David.
He was originally sort of earmarked to be a major contributor to the Twilight Zone, and he wrote, I think, 3 scripts in total. Only one of them was filmed, and that was I Sing. But the 2 others were more or less rejected by Serling.
He didn't take that well, and he and Serling.
Any idea what were those two? Just out of curiosity, as a
one of
Twilight
them,
Zone fan and a Bradbury fan.
right? One of them was Here There Be Tigers, which is set on an alien planet, and I can't remember how the plot goes, but I remember the main sort of feature of the story is people sort of start flying, with their arms. I can't remember why or how. And I think that was considered impossible to film in a realistic way. The other one, I think, might have been Miracle of Rare Device, which is two guys pull up on the highway and they see a city off in the distance, like a kind of a mirage, and they speculate on what it is. And I think that might have been rejected more.
They adapted that one, I think, in the Ray Bradbury Theater, and that's a very good story.
Yeah.
I'm surprised because that seems like that would have fit right in with the Twilight Zone. I mean, that was a great one.
But there's no action to it, so that
I get it, but
I can see people being turned off by that. But yeah, it could be done well. Yeah.
There's it's funny too, because we always think of just that core writers writing for the Twilight Zone, and I'd never heard of that screenwriter. So that's interesting. But I know there's like a Kuttner and Moore. There was one episode based on a Kuttner and Moore story, although Serling wrote the teleplay for it. But I just, that the whole Twilight Zone thing was, I do think that it was more like the way they butted heads about things was just kind of famous, that Bradbury I think kind of stormed out of a meeting with Serling, and the idea was that they just didn't get along. I had, one of my goals in the last year was to try and get into the Serling archive at UCLA, and you can only get in with permission from the family. And I know I've mentioned this many times on the show, but I have written that letter and I never got a response. So I would love to go to that archive. It's physically in the same room as the Gene Roddenberry archive, and they gave me access to that one, but not to the Serling one. But and here's another thing too. I know Bradbury. I know this from looking in one of the letters that I saw in the Roddenberry archive. They talk about how they approached Bradbury, and both Bradbury and Asimov said they were not interested in writing for Star Trek. And they, Asimov ended up like starting a correspondence with Roddenberry, but as far as I can tell, I didn't see anything from Bradbury, but just wasn't interested in Star Trek.
Bradbury, he went on a tour of the sets with Gene Roddenberry.
Yeah.
So he knew about it, and it kind of makes sense for Bradbury to be considered for Star Trek, because Bradbury had written so much for TV and film at that point.
Yeah.
And what Roddenberry was trying to do was get science fiction writers who also were script writers. So you got Theodore Sturgeon, you got Jerome Bixby, you got Harlan Ellison, George Clayton Johnson. Bradbury is kind of another obvious one for that list. And so Bradbury was given a tour, but he said to Roddenberry, I can't write. Well, I'm not comfortable writing other people's characters. Now he's done that. I can see that. He's done lots of adaptations, but
what would
have?
How would have David? You being a Trekkie, right, and me being a Trekkie, and I'm trying to imagine what a Bradbury story with the Bradbury beats would look like in the Star Trek universe. Would it be like? Well, are we looking at another piece of the action sort of thing? Are we looking at something that's more homely?
He couldn't have done a worse job. He could not have done a worse job than A.E. von Vogt. A.E. von Vogt's treatments are just ridiculous.
I just don't know how it would have fit in. It would have almost have to be a feel-good episode in some way, right? Or a totally horrific episode. One of those two. Well, I don't see it going another way.
It's actually in a letter where it was in a memo where they're talking about rewriting one of the von Vogt scripts, and they're talking about other science fiction writers that they were working on or wanting to approach, because the whole thing is Roddenberry wanted these respected science fiction writers to make Star Trek respectable as science fiction, and which I wish modern Star Trek would do the same. But he just, but I don't know what Bradbury would have done, but it should be no surprise that I do have a short story where I try to conceive of what a Philip K. Dick episode of Star Trek would look like. So I have had that thought experiment, and it has already been rejected by one magazine. But
let me ask this, Phil: what's Bradbury's view of Mars's Heaven? I mean, he had to talk about it at some point, right?
Yeah, he didn't talk about it very much, though. He mostly just referred to it for its sort of nostalgia element and the fact that it was a horror story. But he clearly liked it because I don't know if you know this, but he wrote probably about 5 screenplay versions of the Martian Chronicles over the years that were never filmed. Yeah. And every time, he makes different choices about which stories to include in the adaptation when he writes the screenplay. But every single time, Mars's Heaven is in there as, one of the central stories. So he clearly saw it as an essential tale that you can't do Martian Chronicles without it. It's not the only story that he thought was essential, but he clearly had a soft spot for it. And in one of the screenplays that he wrote in 1962 or thereabouts, he really develops the ending of Mars's Heaven so that it doesn't just end with them being dead and buried under the ground. They fight back against the Martians, and there's lots of action that goes on.
What I also found interesting about Mars's Heaven is at the very end, all of the Earthlings, all of the spacemen are dead.
Yeah.
But yet they're having a human funeral for them.
Yeah.
Right? They're there and they're like, oh, their faces are changing slightly. And they're giving a eulogy as if they were still on Earth.
Yeah.
I found that to be a very fascinating, well, why would that happen?
Yeah.
Is there something about humanity the Martians found interesting? That they liked some of the nostalgia that we saw? I mean, it's fun to speculate about those things, but I wish Bradbury would have explained. Well, I mean, nowadays authors will explain those things, right? They'll go on a million podcasts. Ray Bradbury could have been on your podcast.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying it's an interesting thing that they have a human funeral when clearly everyone's been dead.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the interesting thing for me, I mean, I've seen some
and they say they're brave. I think, like they say, these are brave men.
Yes. I've seen some people say, well, the story doesn't make sense because if it was all in the head of the Earth, in the heads of the Earthmen, and they're all dead, how can the ending possibly exist? But if you read the story carefully, we don't know for sure what's going on. The thing about it being in the heads of the Earthlings is an idea that comes from the captain, and he may well be wrong.
Oh, I think I don't read it that way at all. It's interesting you say that. I read it as they pluck these ideas from the heads.
Yeah.
And they were able to change shape, right? And they were able to form things.
Yeah.
So I think the captain is very wrong. Especially because his brothers like you aren't. So there's clearly an interaction there. It's not in their heads. But then why have the funeral? You see, that's the thing that I'm like, it's interesting.
Because I take it as the Martians are so taken with this role play that they've undertaken that they can't just let it go. They can't just switch it off when the reason for it existing has gone away. And when you see it in the context of the Martian Chronicles, there's another story a bit later on called The Martian, where there's an old couple on Mars, and one of the reasons they've gone to Mars is to try and forget about their dead son. And they come to Mars, and lo and behold, their dead son turns up. Now, it turns out it's a Martian, and it's a kind of a shapeshifter. It's able to make itself look like whoever you are thinking about when you're standing in front of this Martian. And he's able to take the place of their son, and they're sort of happy with that. But they go into town with him one day, and this Martian is confused because he's in the company of lots of other people, and he has to take on the form of whoever these other people are thinking about. So this Martian is constantly shifting his appearance as he tries to adapt to all these others around him. So once you've got that story later on in the book, that sort of links back to Mars's Heaven and makes you think about, so that's what was going on with those Martians. Once they were kind of psychically converted into humans, they couldn't easily let go of it because that's the way they function. So
that's a fascinating concept for the 40s when written. Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna start. We've been going for a while, so I'm gonna start wrapping us up. I did remember too that Star Trek did do a version of Star Trek Voyager in one of the later seasons, did a kind of take on this with an episode called In the Flesh, which was about the species from the other dimension, the species 8472, and they create a simulated version of Starfleet Academy. And what's funny is that it's kind of like all the Starfleet people, like their idea of heaven is like their academy days. So like when they, create the simulated version, and I interviewed Brandon Braga, who wrote that episode, and when we were talking about literary influences on the episodes of Star Trek, because he talked a lot about Twilight Zone as being an influence, but I'm almost positive that he mentioned Bradbury as one of the influences that he tried to pay homage to in Voyager. So I think that one is definitely paying off Mars's Heaven.
There's the other one that springs to mind is The Cage, the very original pilot of Star Trek. When Captain Pike is he's in the cage and he's seeing Vina, and they recreate his world for him, and his horse and the picnic and all that stuff. So that's very similar to what's going on in Mars's Heaven.
Absolutely, which we'll be seeing how that plays out in Strange New Worlds very soon. And in a season and a half from now. So let's did you
real quick question, because I did want to get back to this story, because maybe Phil knows. All I know is that it's a story, but I don't know if it's true. I mentioned how I got into it watching through the EC Comics, and EC Comics clearly did do adaptions of stories that were not licensed at the time, and the stories that Bradbury writes them a letter and goes, "Hey, I love your story. By the way, where's my royalties for the story my story, which clearly you just forgot to send." Is that true? Is that a true story, or is that a myth? Because, I always heard it and I always thought it was hilarious because it comes off with the good nature that Bradbury's like, "Hey, I'm not going to fight you over this, but, come on."
Yeah, it's absolutely true. The letter exists. The letter that he sent. Yeah, absolutely. And it was acknowledged by, what's his name? Is it Bill Gaines? Is that
Bill Gaines?
Yeah. He acknowledged the letter and said that it's a completely true story.
Because he had some fantastic adaptions later on, including this one. This one was he's given the credit, not all of that. But again, that was my first exposure, and it's still near and dear to my heart. I think someday I might even be able to get that issue of Weird Science, but not searching it out.
That happened to PKD, where the fiction outlet of Pravda, the Russian newspaper, had a fiction journal, and they reprinted his story "Foster You're Dead," translated into Russian, and it drove Phil nuts that it was the highest distribution that he had ever received in a story at the time.
Probably didn't make him any more paranoid either that Pravda's that somehow it's being printed in Russia.
Right. Well, and if you know the story "Foster You're Dead," it's about bomb shelters. So it's basically a Keeping Up with the Joneses story, where a kid's like mad at his dad because he doesn't have the newest and greatest bomb shelter, and all the other kids have bomb shelters that are great. And it's a good story, Foster You're Dead. It's his best Cold War story. But that happened to him too, and he ended up writing, and supposedly, according to Phil, but you never know because he made up he was a chronic exaggerator, but he claimed that they eventually sent him a bunch of rubles for that story. But who knows? Okay, so Phil, can you tell folks about the Ray Bradbury Center and your podcast so people can find you?
Sure. The Bradbury Center, I think we should probably just explain how it came about. I mean, there's a couple of academic researchers, John Ellert and Bill Tupont, who happened to both end up working at IUPUI in Indianapolis. And they were both researching Bradbury, and they decided to collaborate. So they created this center. But then when Bradbury died, he left his papers to the center, basically, and a load of books and loads of physical artifacts as well. So, I mean, you guys know because you've been there, but if you go to the Bradbury Center, you can see Bradbury.
Sat in his writing chair.
Yeah, you can see his desk. They've reconstructed his office in great detail. It's much tidier than the real office ever was.
Yeah.
But it's a reasonable facsimile of it with the original furniture and typewriters and so on. But the main purpose of it really is to house Bradbury's papers. So sort of academic researchers can go in there and look at Bradbury's manuscripts and correspondence and all of that.
And if you go there, there's also the Kurt Vonnegut Museum in Indianapolis.
That's right.
And Mark and I went to the Lilly Library a couple years ago and touched a lock of Edgar Allan Poe's hair.
Oh.
But again, that wasn't the highlight for me. The highlight for me was touching the Frankenstein volume.
Yeah.
The 1818 Frankenstein volume, the 3 volumes, which I still can't believe they let us touch because that's like, well over $1 million copy.
Yeah.
But still very cool.
Yeah, we had a pretty nerdy day that day. And Boucher's papers are there too, but we didn't look at any of the Boucher's papers, but we did see first draft straight from the typewriter of Goldfinger, Ian Fleming's Goldfinger, which
with notes and annotations on it and everything.
Yeah, and the original title was etched out and Goldfinger was handwritten on it, which was very cool. You can do the same with Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune at Fullerton, and many PKD papers.
Indianapolis and Indiana in general has a lot of cool sci-fi stuff. The Vonnegut stuff is amazing too.
Yeah.
So you should all come here and see the Bradbury Center and the Vonnegut Museum. Absolutely.
And and also connected to the Bradbury Center on this here podcast, we have Mark as an IU alum, and my father taught at IU for a bazillion years. So, we love that it's connected to Indiana University. So, and that being said, Indiana University should put the IDS back in print. And I just want to put that
We're
up.
working on that.
Yeah, I know.
Outside funding.
Yeah.
Although I'll be honest, I never really thought the IDS was great. The idea of the IDS is great. Yeah, it's a student newspaper.
Yeah.
It was
it
what
should be
it
in print.
I don't disagree.
Okay. So Phil, tell us about your podcast. Sorry, we digressed.
Yes. I have a podcast called Bradbury 100, which I started in Bradbury's centenary year, which was 2020. And that year, everyone was planning to celebrate Bradbury at things like Comic-Con and various events in Indianapolis and elsewhere. And I would have been part of those events. And then, of course, we had this pandemic thing that stopped all that. So I created a podcast where I could at least talk to people who knew Bradbury or worked with him. So that's one of my podcasts. I've also got one called Science Fiction 101, which is more generally about science fiction. But the Bradbury one is my
now, see, I did not know about that one. I'm going to have to start listening to that one because.
Yeah.
Well, I just subscribed to both, so there you go. Congratulations.
I have listened to episodes here and there of Bradbury 100. Like I said, I'm not the biggest Bradbury fan, so like listening to all of them is probably less likely. But I there's
I
several.
try to make it. I try to make it as accessible as possible. And this
It's a
last
great
year,
podcast, and it's one of the reasons
oh, thank
why
you.
I definitely you were on my list from the beginning.
Thank
I
you.
wanted to have Dr. Ackerman on as well, just to physically have somebody from the center, but he was happy to have you hold up the center. But I will say, also your appearances on Seth's podcast have all been really, really great. Like you've been his Bradbury expert.
Yeah.
Just like I have served that role for PKD and Le Guin a couple times. So, but yeah. So and you can find that on anywhere where podcasts are podcasting.
Yeah, I mean it's on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual places. But also on my website, which is it's on the screen there, bradburymedia.co.uk. It's got all my stuff on there, my blog, and also my Bradbury reviews of books and films and stuff like that.
Yeah, and Phil and I were kind of throwing around some ideas beforehand on some ways we could collaborate in the future, and I think we'll try to make those happen. But I really appreciate all the work that you do. Everyone here knows that I am all about those who preserve the history of this genre and communicate for those from especially the 20th century and the early golden age and new wave science fiction. That is a huge passion of mine. So whether he's my favorite or not is not the issue. I appreciate what you do. And if people haven't read his book on writing, this is a really incredible book. And it really is. It's actually one of my favorite things Bradbury did. So
Bill, let me ask you this, and I know we've gone on long, but I have to ask you this. What's the one story you would recommend that people have to read of Bradbury's that they may not know? Not, something super popular, but maybe a deep dive that they should read, in your opinion.
I always recommend a story called The Toynbee Convector, which was written in the 1980s, and it's a time travel story, sort of. But you have to read it to find out. But it's very good. And people think that Bradbury's best work was over by about 1955, and they're wrong. He wrote some very good stuff right through to the end of his career. But The Toynbee Convector is one I always recommend because not
there
many
was
people...
the Toynbee, and it's interesting. Have you ever heard of the Toynbee tiles?
Yes, I have. And as far as I know, there's no connection between the two things, apart from Toynbee, who is the common
It's
name.
interesting. It's a whole conspiratorial thing. But there's a Toynbee tile right near my house.
Is there?
Yeah, right there.
How long has it been there? How long has it been?
It's in the parking lot of a former electronics store. It's been there a long time, but who knows?
Yeah.
And there's several downtown in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very good story. I like the Toynbee Convector. David,
Mark,
go ahead. I don't know.
Mark,
look, I'm geeking out, man. Can I geek out, David? I don't get to geek out often.
Do you want people to find you? You don't really.
No, because if you find me, you're usually in front of me for a criminal charge. So you can find me on this podcast at the end of every year talking about our best reads of the year. And I've got some good ones this year. Although the only thing I would say is, David, don't include arcs, because two of my best reads are arcs that you had on last year. So don't start tricking people into thinking there are books out there that can read that aren't.
I get a lot of arcs, dude. I'm sorry. I get
those two that you brought up last year are some of the best books I read this year. So
that's fine. You read them this year, so that's for you. That's I did read again. I obviously had a lot of arcs, so this year.
So you can find me on this channel. That's where you could find me. Congratulations.
You'll be back it'll be right around January 1st. We'll post it.
It always is.
And and I just again want to put it out there that November 23rd in San Francisco at SF and SF. And every Tuesday night, 6:00, you can come talk PKD with us. We don't just talk PKD. I mean, that's our main focus. And like I said, this week we're doing Chinese science fiction. We just had Ken Liu on. So look for some, we have lots of different guests. We just had John Ryder on, the author of Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction. So really good stuff that will be hitting our YouTube feed soon. So
Phil, you just did an episode on the Toynbee convecting for beginners.
Well, yeah.
I'm
That's
just
probably
glad
why it was fresh in my mind.
You're fresh in your mind.
Yeah. Well, on that note, folks, we will be back in this series probably next month with The Little Black Box by C.M. Kornbluth. We are also going to talk a little bit about some other C.M. Kornbluth, because there's a C.M. Kornbluth story that was one of the first stories that PKD read in the very first issue of Stirring Science Stories, which was, this was the first magazine that PKD ever bought for science fiction. So we're going to cover one of those. We're going to talk a little bit about that story too. I'm knocking over my Barry Malzberg books. So on that note, that's what we'll be back with next time. As far as between now and then, I'm not sure who I'm gonna have some guests from some newer books coming on here soon. But we'll and I think maybe might be doing an episode covering Alien Earth, because there's a lot of PKD themes in Alien Earth, and I've had a lot of requests to talk about Alien Earth. So I might be doing a panel on that. So just keep your eye out for that. In other words, folks, we'll see you on other things. Please check out Phil's work, and continue to do that. What's that face for?
Don't check out Mark's work, is what I'm saying.
Don't check out Mark's
Don't
work.
check out Mark's work.
Don't get arrested in Indianapolis and end up in front of
That's
Mark.
pretty much it. Don't check me out.
Yeah, don't check out your work. And we'll see you later on in the year. So thanks a lot, folks. I'm always terrible at ending these things. We'll see you next time.